In the marble lobby of the Grand Pine Hotel, a quiet veteran was about to face humiliation that would ignite a firestorm. What started as seeking simple accommodation took a shocking turn when he came face to face with prejudice disguised as professionalism. David Martinez wasn't your typical hotel guest. For 15 years, he had spent his life as a decorated Air Force specialist, known for pulling wounded comrades from burning wreckage under enemy fire. When he encountered discriminatory rejection, he had no idea his entire squadron would soon discover how their war hero had been treated, transforming one man's humiliation into a community's reckoning with honor. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Greyhound bus wheezed to a stop outside Miller's gas station, its air brakes hissing like an angry serpent. Senior Airman David Martinez shouldered his duffel bag and stepped onto the cracked asphalt of Pine Ridge, Montana, a town that looked smaller than he remembered, more fragile somehow. The mountains still loomed over the valley like ancient sentinels, their peaks dusted with early October snow, but everything else seemed diminished. Or maybe he was the one who had grown too large for this place. The bus pulled away with a diesel rumble that made David's shoulders tense involuntarily. His hand moved to his left thigh, fingers tracing the scar beneath his jeans, a nervous habit he'd developed since Kandahar, since Riley. "David!" Linda's voice cut through the afternoon quiet, bright with forced cheer. His younger sister jogged across the parking lot, her teacher's cardigan flapping behind her like wings. She looked older than her 32 years, worry lines etched around her eyes that hadn't been there when he'd deployed for his third tour. She embraced him fiercely, and David felt his body go rigid despite himself. Too close, too sudden. In Afghanistan, sudden movements meant, "God, I've missed you," Linda whispered against his shoulder. "We all have." David managed a smile, the expression feeling foreign on his face. "Missed you too, sis." But as she pulled back, studying his face with the intensity of someone searching for damage, David saw the moment recognition flickered in her eyes. He wasn't the same man who'd left 3 years ago. The David who'd grown up fishing these streams and hiking these trails had been replaced by someone harder, hollower, someone who startled at backfiring cars and counted exits in every room. "Come on," Linda said, her voice deliberately light. "Tom and the kids are waiting at home. Maria's made your favorite, enchiladas." They drove through Pine Ridge's main street in Linda's aging Honda, past the feed store where old Mr. Patterson still sat on his porch, past the diner where David had taken Jenny Carpenter to prom a lifetime ago. The familiar sights should have been comforting, but they felt like museum pieces, relics of a world he no longer belonged to. "So," Linda said, glancing at him as they stopped at the town's only traffic light, "how long are you planning to stay?" The question hung between them, loaded with hope and apprehension. David had been deliberately vague in his emails, mentioning only that he needed time to figure things out after his discharge. "Not sure yet," he replied. "Just need some quiet for a while." Linda's house sat on Elm Street, a modest 2-story with a white picket fence that Tom had painted last spring, according to Linda's letters. The yard was scattered with toys, a pink bicycle, a soccer ball, evidence of the normal life his sister had built while he was learning to field-strip weapons in the dark. Tom emerged from the garage, wiping his hands on a rag. David's brother-in-law was a good man, steady, reliable, everything David had once been. They shook hands, Tom's grip firm but careful, as if he was afraid David might break. "Welcome home." "Your brother?" Tom said. "Good to have you back." The kids, Maria, 7, and little Tommy, 5, peered at him from behind their father with wide, curious eyes. David was a stranger to them, this uncle who existed only in photographs and occasional video calls. When he knelt to their level, forcing another smile, Maria stepped forward tentatively. "Mummy says you were fighting bad guys," she said with the brutal honesty of childhood. David's throat tightened. "Something like that, sweetheart." But Tommy hung back, clutching a toy helicopter, and David felt a familiar stab of guilt. Even children could sense the darkness he carried now, the weight of things done and seen and lost. Dinner was a careful dance of normal conversation. Linda asked about his flight. There hadn't been one. He'd taken the bus because airports made him nervous. Tom inquired about his plans. David had none. And the children chatted about school and friends and the thousand small dramas of ordinary life. David responded when appropriate, but his mind kept drifting. Riley would have loved this, he thought, watching little Tommy demolish his enchiladas with 5-year-old enthusiasm. Riley had always talked about having kids someday, about teaching them to fly remote-control planes in his backyard. But Riley was in the ground now, 6 feet under Arlington's manicured grass, and David was sitting at a dinner table in Montana, trying to pretend he belonged anywhere. Later, as Linda tucked the children into bed, David stood on the back porch, smoking a cigarette, a habit he'd picked up overseas. The mountain air was crisp and clean, nothing like the dust and diesel of Afghanistan, but it couldn't wash away the taste of memories. "You know those things will kill you," Linda said, joining him in the darkness. "Lot of things can kill you," David replied, taking another drag. "Cigarettes are probably the least of my worries." Linda was quiet for a moment, then, "David, I'm worried about you. You seem distant, disconnected." He wanted to tell her about the nightmares, about the way his heart raced when helicopters passed overhead, about the crushing weight of guilt that made him wonder why he'd made it home when Riley hadn't. Instead, he flicked his cigarette into the darkness and watched its ember arc through the night. "I just need time, Linda, space to sort things out. There are people who can help," she pressed gently. "Counselors, support groups. The VA has programs." "I'm fine," David said, the lie coming automatically. "Just adjusting." But they both knew he wasn't fine. The man who'd left Pine Ridge had been eager, optimistic, ready to serve his country and make a difference. The man who'd returned was a ghost haunting his own life, carrying wounds that couldn't be seen but never stopped bleeding. The next morning, David walked the familiar streets of his childhood, searching for something he couldn't name. Pine Ridge looked exactly the same weathered storefronts, the same cracked sidewalks, the same sense of time moving slowly through the mountain valley. But David felt like a visitor in his own memories, disconnected from the boy who'd run these streets and dreamed of adventure. He found himself at Riverside Park, where he and Riley had spent countless summer afternoons before enlisting together. The playground was empty now, swings moving gently in the breeze like pendulums marking time he'd lost. David sat on the bench where they'd planned their futures, 2 18-year-olds convinced they'd see the world and come home heroes. Only one of them had come home at all. The weight of being back, of trying to fit into a life that no longer felt like his own, pressed down on David's shoulders like a physical thing. Linda meant well, but her house was full of the sounds of normal life, children laughing, the television's constant chatter, the domestic rhythms of a family at peace. Every sound made David's nerves sing with tension, reminded him of how far he'd traveled from the person he used to be. He needed space, time to think without well-meaning questions and concerned glances. Time to figure out how to be David Martinez, civilian, instead of Senior Airman Martinez, warrior. That afternoon, he made his decision. He would find somewhere temporary to stay, somewhere quiet, where he could work through the tangle of his thoughts without feeling like a disruption in his sister's carefully ordered world. Pine Ridge had grown slightly in his absence, a new strip mall on the outskirts, a few more houses in the developments near the highway. But at its heart sat the Grand Pine Hotel, the town's single upscale establishment, built in the 1920s and recently renovated to attract the occasional tourist or business traveler. David studied the hotel's elegant facade from across the street, its stone columns and brass fixtures speaking of permanence and respectability. It would be expensive, but he had money saved from his deployments, combat pay with nowhere to spend. It except the occasional care package home. More importantly, it would be anonymous. He could be just another guest, another face passing through, without the weight of hometown expectations and childhood memories pressing down on him. David crossed the street toward the Grand Pine Hotel, not knowing that his decision would set in motion a chain of events that would force both him and his hometown to confront truths neither was prepared to face. He was looking for peace, for a quiet place to heal his invisible wounds. Instead, he was walking toward a collision that would change everything. David paused at the Grand Pine Hotel's brass-handled doors, studying his reflection in the polished glass. 3 days of beard stubble shadowed his jaw, and his civilian clothes, faded jeans and a worn flannel shirt, looked shabby against the hotel's refined backdrop. For a moment he considered walking away, finding somewhere less conspicuous, to lay low while he sorted through the wreckage of his reintegration. But the alternative was returning to Linda's house, to the careful conversations and worried glances, to the suffocating weight of being someone he no longer was. David squared his shoulders and pushed through the doors. The lobby was everything small-town elegance aspired to be. Polished marble floors, leather chairs arranged around a stone fireplace, oil paintings of Montana landscapes adorning cream-colored walls. Classical music played softly from hidden speakers, and the air carried the faint scent of cedar and expensive furniture polish. Behind the mahogany front desk stood a young man in a crisp white shirt and navy blazer, his blonde hair perfectly styled, his smile practiced and professional. His nameplate read, "Brandon Pierce, front desk manager." He looked up as David approached, and his expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a subtle tightening around the eyes, a slight stiffening of his posture. "Good afternoon," Brandon said, his tone neutral but somehow conveying that David's presence was unexpected. "How may I help you?" "I'd like a room," David replied simply, noting how Brandon's gaze lingered on his clothes, his unshaven face, the worn duffel bag slung over his shoulder. "I see." Brandon's fingers moved across his computer keyboard with deliberate slowness. "And how many nights were you planning to stay?" "Not sure yet. Maybe a week, possibly longer." Brandon's eyebrows rose slightly. "Our rooms start at $125 per night," he said, his tone suggesting that this information might encourage David to reconsider his options. David reached for his wallet, producing a credit card and his driver's license. "That's fine." Brandon examined the ID with exaggerated care, as if suspecting it might be counterfeit. "David Martinez," he read aloud. "Local address." His tone carried a note of surprise, as if he couldn't reconcile David's appearance with someone who belonged in Pine Ridge. "I grew up here," David said quietly. "Just got back." "Back from where?" Brandon asked, still holding the ID. David hesitated. In his experience, mentioning military service usually generated one of two responses: either uncomfortable gratitude or barely concealed suspicion about what kind of person chose to play soldier. Neither was particularly appealing at the moment. "Work," he said simply. Brandon's fingers continued their theatrical dance across the keyboard, his frown deepening with each keystroke. "I'm afraid we have a problem," he said finally, his voice carrying false regret. "Our system is showing that we're completely booked for the next 2 weeks." David glanced around the quiet lobby, noting the absence of luggage, the empty seating areas, the general stillness that suggested anything but a full house. Through the lobby's windows, he could see the parking lot, perhaps a dozen cars scattered across spaces that could accommodate 10 times that number. "Completely booked?" David asked, his voice leveled despite the familiar tightness building in his chest. The same sensation he'd felt during incoming mortar attacks, when the world suddenly became a place where normal rules didn't apply. "Yes, sir," Brandon said with theatrical sympathy. "We're hosting a corporate retreat this week, and I'm afraid they've reserved our entire facility. Very exclusive group, high-end clients who require absolute privacy." From his position behind the desk, Brandon's body language radiated smug satisfaction, as if he'd solved an unpleasant problem with minimal effort. He slid David's credit card and ID back across the marble surface with the tips of his fingers, as if avoiding contamination. "Perhaps you might try the Pine Cone Motel out on Highway 2, Brandon suggested helpfully. "Much more appropriate for extended stays." The Pine Cone Motel was where truckers and traveling salesmen stayed when they couldn't afford better, a place with thin walls, questionable sanitation, and rates by the hour. Brandon's suggestion carried the clear message that this was where David belonged, with the transients and the desperate. David felt something cold and familiar settling in his stomach, the same feeling he'd experienced during his final medical evaluation, when the psychiatrist had looked at him with poorly concealed distaste and suggested that perhaps military service attracted a certain type of individual. The same look he'd gotten from the VA counselor who'd implied that his problems were mostly in his head. "I understand," David said quietly, pocketing his cards. Behind Brandon, he noticed a reservation board clearly visible through the office doorway, showing multiple empty slots for the next several days. As David turned to leave, he became aware of other guests in the lobby. A middle-aged couple near the fireplace, an elderly woman reading by the window, a businessman checking his phone. All of them had witnessed the exchange, their carefully averted gazes speaking volumes about their discomfort with the scene they'd just observed. From a partially open office door behind the front desk, David caught a glimpse of an older man in an expensive suit, watching the interaction with obvious displeasure. Their eyes met briefly, steel-grey meeting worn brown, before the man stepped back into the shadows of his office. "Have a pleasant afternoon," Brandon called after him, his voice carrying just enough volume to ensure the other guests heard his professional courtesy. David walked through the lobby with the measured pace he'd learned in the military, never rushed, never showing weakness, even when the world was collapsing around you. His hand found the scar on his thigh again, fingers tracing the raised tissue. Through his jeans as he pushed through the brass-handled doors. The October air hit his face like a slap, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and approaching winter. Behind him, the Grand Pine Hotel stood like a monument to respectability and belonging, things that apparently didn't extend to worn-looking veterans with uncertain futures. David walked to his sister's Honda, parked across the street, and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the steering wheel, and he closed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe slowly and deliberately. In Afghanistan, he'd faced enemy fire with steady nerves and clear thinking. He'd performed critical maintenance on aircraft under mortar attack, had earned commendations for his calm under pressure. But here, in his hometown, a hotel clerk's, prejudice had shaken him more than incoming rounds ever had. The rejection wasn't just about a room. It was about belonging, about having a place in the world he'd fought to protect. It was about being seen as something other than a problem to be managed or a charity case to be pitied. David started the Honda and pulled away from the Grand Pine Hotel, not knowing that his humiliation had been observed by more than just uncomfortable bystanders. Not knowing that tomorrow would bring visitors to Pine Ridge who would view his treatment very differently than Brandon Pierce had anticipated. The town looked the same as he drove back toward Linda's house, but something fundamental had shifted. The place he'd called home had just told him, in no uncertain terms, that he no longer belonged there. And David Martinez, veteran of 3 tours in Afghanistan, survivor of IED attacks and firefights, felt more lost than he ever had in the mountains of Kandahar. The morning sun cast long shadows across Pine Ridge's main street as 3 military members emerged from a rented SUV outside the Grand Pine Hotel. Master Sergeant Elena Rodriguez moved with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to command, her dress blue uniform immaculate despite the early hour and long drive from Colorado Springs. Behind her, Technical Sergeant Mike "Tank" Williams unfolded his considerable frame from the passenger seat, his massive shoulders straining against his service coat, while Staff Sergeant Amy Chen gathered her medical kit from the back, a habit from deployments that never quite left combat medics. Riley would have loved this place, Tank said quietly, his deep voice carrying across the crisp morning air as he studied the hotel's elegant facade. Remember how he always talked about staying somewhere with actual room service when we got back? Elena's expression softened momentarily. Captain Riley Thompson had indeed dreamed of simple luxuries, clean sheets, hot showers that lasted longer than 2 minutes, meals that didn't come from plastic packages, dreams that would never be fulfilled now. "He's why we're here," Elena replied, her voice carrying the authority that had kept her squadron together through 3 deployments. "Let's make sure we honor him properly." Brandon Pierce looked up from behind the front desk as the 3 service members entered the lobby, and his demeanor underwent an immediate transformation. Where yesterday he had radiated subtle hostility toward David, now he practically glowed with obsequious charm. "Good morning." Brandon's voice carried warm professionalism as he took in their uniforms, the ribbons and badges that spoke of service and sacrifice. "Welcome to the Grand Pine Hotel. I'm Brandon Pierce, front desk manager. How may I assist you today?" Elena approached the desk with measured steps, her bearing unmistakably military despite the civilian setting. "Master Sergeant Rodriguez, we have reservations for the Thompson Memorial Service Group." "Of course!" Brandon's fingers flew across his keyboard with genuine enthusiasm now. "Mrs. Thompson made those arrangements personally. We're honored to host such distinguished guests." He paused, his expression shifting to appropriate solemnity. "Please accept our condolences for your loss. Captain Thompson's sacrifice will not be forgotten." Amy exchanged a glance with Tank, both noting the stark contrast between Brandon's current demeanor and the reports they'd received about how other veterans had been treated in town. Elena's eyes narrowed slightly. She'd developed a keen sense for people who performed respect rather than felt it. "The captain was a good man," Elena said simply. "The best pilot I ever served with." "I'm sure he was," Brandon replied, producing keycards with flourish. "I've upgraded your rooms to our premium suites at no additional charge, the least we can do for those who serve our country." As Brandon processed their check-in, the hotel's front door opened again, admitting a woman in her mid-50s whose bearing immediately commanded attention. Margaret Thompson moved with the controlled grace of someone carrying profound grief while maintaining absolute dignity. Her silver hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her black dress spoke of mourning that had become a permanent state rather than a temporary condition. Elena straightened instinctively. She'd met Mrs. Thompson only once before, at Riley's funeral, but the woman's strength had left an indelible impression. Here was a mother who had buried her child, yet somehow found the fortitude to organize a memorial service in his honor. "Mrs. Thompson," Elena said, moving toward her with genuine warmth, "thank you for arranging all this. Riley meant everything to our squadron." Margaret's composure cracked slightly as she embraced Eleanor. "He spoke of you constantly in his letters," she said, her voice thick with emotion. his top sergeant, who kept everyone safe and sane. Tank and Amy joined them, and for a few moments the hotel lobby became a place of shared memory and mutual comfort. Margaret had insisted on this gathering, not just the formal military funeral at Arlington, but something more personal, more intimate. A chance for Riley's squadron to remember the man behind the rank, the friend behind the hero. "Have you heard from David?" Tank asked, glancing around the lobby as if expecting their missing squadron member to materialize. "I tried calling him yesterday, but it went straight to voicemail." Elena's expression tightened with concern. David Martinez had been Riley's closest friend in the unit, the one who'd held the captain as he died, who'd carried more guilt than any one person should bear. His absence from their gathering was both expected and heartbreaking. "He's here. In town," Margaret said quietly. "I spoke with his sister yesterday. She's worried about him, says he's not adjusting well to civilian life." Amy nodded knowingly. As the squadron's medic and someone studying psychology, she'd seen too many good soldiers struggle with the transition home. David's case was particularly difficult. Survivor's guilt compounded by PTSD, all wrapped up in the impossible task of building a new identity after losing the one that had defined him for years. "I should reach out," Tank said, pulling out his phone. "Martinez has been alone too long." Elena watched him dial, noting the careful way Tank held the phone. His massive hands could field strip a rifle in darkness, but treated electronics like delicate flowers. The call went through after several rings. "Hey Martinez, it's Tank." His voice carried the easy camaraderie of men who'd shared foxholes and worse. "We're in town for Riley's memorial. You doing okay?" Elena watched Tank's expression shift as he listened, his easygoing demeanor giving way to something harder, more focused. Amy noticed it too, her medic's instincts alert to changes in emotional temperature. "Wait, hold up," Tank said, his voice taking on an edge. "Run that by me again. What happened at the hotel?" The lobby suddenly felt smaller as Tank's voice carried, drawing curious glances from Brandon behind the desk and other guests scattered around the seating areas. Elena moved closer, her command instinct sensing trouble brewing. "Some desk clerk." "Told you what?" Tank's voice rose incrementally, the careful control of a man who'd learned to manage his anger in combat situations. "Yesterday? Here at the Grand Pine?" Brandon Pierce went very still behind the front desk, his complexion shifting toward pale as he began to understand the implications of the conversation he was overhearing. Amy put a steadying hand on Tank's arm, recognizing the signs of controlled rage that preceded action. Elena's eyes had gone cold and calculating, the look that had made enemy commanders underestimate her exactly once before learning better. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "Martinez, stay put," Tank said into the phone, his voice now carrying unmistakable authority. "We're coming to see you right now." He ended the call and turned to face Elena and Amy, his expression grim. Behind them, Margaret Thompson had gone very quiet, her mother's intuition recognizing the shift in atmosphere. "One of our own was refused service here yesterday," Tank said quietly, his words carrying across the suddenly silent lobby. "David Martinez, senior airman, 3 tours in Afghanistan. Apparently he didn't look the right kind of customer for this establishment." Elena's gaze moved slowly to Brandon Pierce, who had gone completely motionless behind his mahogany fortress. The same desk where he'd performed his theatrical concern for their loss, where he'd offered upgrades and condolences for Captain Thompson's sacrifice. "Is that so?" Elena's voice carried the deceptive calm that every enlisted person learned to fear from senior NCOs. "How very interesting." The lobby's atmosphere had shifted completely, the respectful quiet of a memorial gathering replaced by something far more dangerous. Margaret Thompson stepped forward, her grief transforming into something sharp and focused. "David Martinez," she said softly, "was Riley's best friend. He held my son as he died." Brandon Pierce realized, perhaps for the first time in his life, that some mistakes couldn't be explained away with clever words and false regret. He was about to learn what happened when you insulted the family of Master Sergeant Elena Rodriguez. And that family included every soldier who'd ever served under her command. Tank's revelation hung in the lobby air like smoke from a firefight. Eleanor's expression had shifted from professional courtesy to something far more dangerous. The cold, calculating look that had made insurgents think twice about engaging her positions in Kandahar province. "Tell me exactly what David said," Elena commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to extracting critical intelligence under pressure. Tank glanced around the lobby, noting Brandon's increasingly pale complexion and the curious stares of other guests. "Maybe we should take this conversation somewhere more private." "No," Margaret Thompson said firmly, surprising everyone with the steel in her voice. "If someone refused service to one of Riley's brothers, I want to hear every word, right here, right now." Elena nodded approvingly. Margaret Thompson was proving to be exactly the kind of gold star mother who understood that some battles couldn't be fought in whispers. Tank pulled up David's contact on his phone, switching to speaker. The line rang twice before David's voice came through, cautious and weary. "Tank, everything okay?" "I'm here with Sergeant Rodriguez and Chen," Tank said, his tone careful but insistent. "Mrs. Thompson, too. We need you to tell them what happened yesterday at the Grand Pine Hotel." A long pause followed, filled with the kind of silence that spoke volumes to people who'd learned to read the spaces between words in combat zones. "It's not important." David's voice carried the hollow quality they'd all heard too often from soldiers trying to minimize their pain. "Just a misunderstanding." "David." Elena's voice cut through the phone with maternal authority. "This is your top sergeant talking. I need a full debrief on yesterday's incident. That's an order." Another pause, then a sound that might have been a bitter laugh. "Roger that, Sergeant. I went to the hotel looking for a room." The desk clerk, young guy, blonde hair, acted like I was carrying the plague, told me they were completely booked, suggested I try the Pinecone Motel instead. Amy Chen stepped closer to the phone, her medic's training focused on the subtle indicators of distress in David's voice. "David, was the hotel actually full?" Parking lot was nearly empty. I could see their reservation board through the office door, plenty of open slots. David's voice carried the flat, emotionless tone of someone reporting facts that had cut too deep to process fully. The guy made it clear I wasn't their kind of customer. Elena's gaze moved to Brandon Pierce, who had gone completely still behind the front desk. She noted how his hands trembled slightly as he pretended to organize paperwork, how his eyes refused to meet hers directly. "What did you do?" Tank asked gently. "Nothing. Left quietly, like always." David's voice carried a resignation that made Elena's chest tighten with protective fury. "Didn't want to cause trouble." Margaret Thompson stepped forward, her maternal instincts overriding all other considerations. "David, honey, this is Mrs. Thompson, Riley's mother. I chose this hotel specifically because of its reputation for hospitality. If they treated you poorly, they treated all of us poorly." "Mrs. Thompson, I'm sorry for your loss." David's voice immediately softened with genuine emotion. "Riley was the best of us. This memorial should be about him, not about—" "It is about him," Elena interrupted, her voice carrying absolute conviction. "Riley died believing he was protecting a country that valued honor and dignity. If we let his friend be disrespected in his memory, what did he die for?" Amy had been studying Brandon Pierce throughout the conversation, noting the micro-expressions. It betrayed his growing panic. As a medic, she'd learned to read people under stress, and Brandon was approaching a complete emotional breakdown. "David," Amy said into the phone, her voice carrying the clinical precision she used with wounded soldiers, "I need you to understand something. What happened to you wasn't just about a hotel room. You're struggling with reintegration and rejection. Like that can significantly impact your healing process." "Doc, I'm fine." "No, you're not," Amy said firmly. "And that's okay, but pretending this didn't affect you is dangerous. You've been carrying Riley's death, your own survivor's guilt, and now this community has essentially told you that you don't belong here." Tank's massive hands had curled into fists, though his voice remained controlled. "Martinez, where are you now?" "Linda's house. But I'm thinking about leaving Pine Ridge. Maybe this isn't the right place for me to—" "Don't you dare," Elena said sharply. "Don't you dare let some ignorant civilian chase you away from your hometown. We didn't survive 3 deployments together just to let you quit now." "Margaret." Thompson moved closer to the phone, her voice carrying the authority of a mother who'd buried one son and refused to lose another. "David, you will attend Riley's memorial service tomorrow. You will hold your head high, and you will remember that you're part of a family that stretches far beyond Pine Ridge, Montana." Elena turned her attention to Brandon Pierce, who had been listening to the conversation with growing horror as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. She approached the front desk with the measured pace of a predator closing in on wounded prey. "Mr. Pierce," Elena said, her voice deceptively calm, "I believe you and I need to have a conversation." Brandon's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. There might have been a misunderstanding yesterday." "Oh, there was definitely a misunderstanding," Eleanor agreed. "You misunderstood who you were dealing with." Amy joined Eleanor at the front desk, her analytical mind already processing the psychological dynamics at play. "Mr. Pierce, help me understand your thinking yesterday. What about Mr. Martinez's appearance suggested he couldn't afford your rates?" He looked. Brandon struggled to find words that wouldn't damn him further. "It was busy and our system was having issues, and your system worked perfectly fine for us this morning," Tank pointed out, his deep voice carrying across the lobby like distant thunder. "Funny how these technical problems seem to be selective." Margaret Thompson stepped forward, and Brandon found himself facing the quiet fury of a Gold Star mother. "Young man, the person you turned away yesterday held my son. As he died serving this country, he earned a Purple Heart saving the lives of his fellow airmen. What exactly have you done lately to earn the right to judge him?" Brandon's carefully constructed world was crumbling around him, and he had no framework for dealing with the reality of his prejudice being exposed so thoroughly. From his office doorway, Robert Harrison had been watching the entire exchange. The hotel owner stepped forward, his face grim with understanding. As a Vietnam veteran who'd hidden his service for decades, he recognized the dynamics at play better than anyone in the room. "Elena," David's voice came through the phone again, "please don't make this into something bigger than it needs to be. I just want to honor Riley and move on." Elena's expression softened as she looked at Margaret Thompson, seeing the pain of a mother who'd already lost one son and was watching another slip away into isolation and despair. "David," Elena said gently, "sometimes moving on means standing still and fighting. Sometimes healing means refusing to let the world tell you that you're worth less than you are." She looked directly at Brandon Pierce as she continued. "We're going to make sure this never happens to another veteran. Not here, not anywhere we have influence." Margaret Thompson nodded firmly. "Riley would have done the same thing. He never let his people fight alone." The battle lines were drawn, and Elena Rodriguez had never been one to back down from a fight, especially when it involved protecting her family. And every soldier who'd ever served under her command was family, whether they remembered it or not. Elena Rodriguez had commanded troops in 3 theaters of operation, navigated Pentagon bureaucracy, and once talked down a suicidal airman with nothing but patience and unwavering authority. But planning a response to David's mistreatment while maintaining the dignity appropriate for Riley's memorial required every leadership skill she'd developed over 20 years of service. Room 314, Eleanor announced to Tank and Amy as they gathered in the hallway outside her suite. We need to hash this out properly. The trio entered Elena's upgraded accommodations, a spacious corner room with mountain views and furniture that spoke of quiet luxury. Elena immediately began pacing, her mind working through tactical considerations, with the same precision she'd once used to plan convoy routes through hostile territory. First priority, Eleanor said, turning to face her companions, is David's emotional state. Amy, professional assessment. Amy settled into one of the room's leather chairs, her medic's training shifting into analytical mode. He's already dealing with survivor's guilt, PTSD, and reintegration anxiety. Yesterday's rejection confirmed his worst fears about not belonging in civilian society. If we handle this wrong, we could push him deeper into isolation. Tank nodded grimly from his position by the window where he'd been studying the street below. Martinez has been pulling away from everyone since Riley died. This hotel thing just gave him another excuse to disappear. But if we do nothing, Elena countered, we're essentially validating the discrimination. We're telling David that his service doesn't matter, that he should accept being treated as a second-class citizen in his own hometown. Amy leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. There's a psychological principle at work here. David's been conditioned to believe that causing trouble makes him a burden. Every time someone shows concern, he retreats further into himself. So, what do you suggest? Elena asked. We make this bigger than just David, Amy said. We make it about all veterans, about the values Riley died defending. That way David can't frame it as people fighting his battles for him. Tank turned from the window, his expression grim but determined. I like it. Riley always said we fight as a unit or we don't fight at all. Elena's phone buzzed with an incoming call. Margaret Thompson's name appeared on the screen. Mrs. Thompson, Elena answered, putting the call on speaker. I've been thinking, Margaret's voice came through with quiet steel. That young man at the front desk, his treatment of David was an insult to every military family. To Riley's memory, Elena exchanged glances with her companions. Ma'am, we were just discussing how to address the situation appropriately. I want to be part of whatever you're planning, Margaret said firmly. Riley would have torn that hotel apart if someone had treated David that way. As his mother, I have the same obligation. Amy leaned toward the phone. Mrs. Thompson, this is Staff Sergeant Chen. We need to be careful about how we approach this. David's emotional state is fragile right now. Then we make sure our actions help him heal instead of making things worse, Margaret replied. I've dealt with enough military bureaucracy to know how these things work. Sometimes you have to make noise to create change. Tank cleared his throat. Mrs. Thompson, what if we use tomorrow's reception as a platform? After the memorial service, when emotions are already running high about sacrifice and service. Eleanor's eyes lit up with understanding. A teachable moment instead of a confrontation. Show Brandon Pierce and anyone else watching what David Martinez really represents. Exactly, Margaret said. Let them see who they turned away. Let them understand what that uniform really means. Elena began pacing again, her tactical mind working through the details. We'd need to coordinate this carefully. Full dress uniforms, formal presentation, maybe some of David's commendations. I have his Purple Heart citation, Margaret said quietly. Riley gave me a copy after David was wounded, saving 3 airmen from that IED attack. Called it the bravest thing he'd ever seen. Amy nodded approvingly. That's perfect. Make it personal and specific. Hard to dismiss heroism when it's documented and witnessed. Tank's phone rang, interrupting their planning. David's name appeared. On the screen. Martinez, Tank answered. How you holding up? I heard about your conversation at the hotel. David's voice carried exhaustion and resignation. Linda told me half the town's talking about it already. Look, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but nothing, Elena said, moving closer to the phone. David, this isn't about you fighting for yourself anymore. This is about us fighting for what's right. Sergeant, please. Riley's memorial should be about honoring him, not about my problems with some hotel clerk. Margaret Thompson's voice cut through the conversation with maternal authority. David, this is exactly about honoring Riley. Do you think my son would have stood by and watched you be treated that way? A long pause followed, filled with the weight of memory and obligation. No, ma'am, David said quietly. Riley never let anyone fight alone. Then don't ask us to do what he never would have done, Margaret replied. Let us stand with you the same way you stood with him. Elena sensed the critical moment in the conversation, the point where David would either accept their support or retreat further into isolation. David, Elena said gently, I'm not asking you to cause trouble. I'm asking you to let your family protect you the same way you protected us in Afghanistan. Tank leaned toward the phone. Martinez, remember when you worked 18 straight hours fixing that bird so we could get Henderson to the field hospital? You didn't do that for glory. You did it because it was right. This is the same thing, Amy added. Sometimes doing what's right means accepting help instead of always giving it. Another pause. Then David's voice came through with a hint of his old strength. What do you need me to do? Eleanor smiled for the first time since learning about the hotel incident. Just show up tomorrow in your dress blues. Let Pine Ridge see who they turned away. And David? Margaret's voice carried the gentle firmness of a mother addressing her son. Riley would be proud of you for fighting this battle. For all of us. After the call ended, Elena looked around the room at her companions, Tank with his unwavering loyalty, Amy with her analytical precision, and Margaret with her quiet strength. They were planning more than just a response to discrimination. They were orchestrating a moment of education and healing. One more thing, Eleanor said, her expression growing serious. We need to reach out to Pastor Mitchell. Margaret mentioned he's former military chaplain. If we're going to do this right, we need someone who understands both the military and civilian perspectives. Tank nodded. And maybe contact the local VFW. If there are other veterans in Pine Ridge, they should know what happened. Amy was already taking notes on her phone. I'll research the psychological impact of public discrimination on veteran mental health. If we're going to educate people, we should do it thoroughly. Elena felt the familiar satisfaction of a plan coming together, the same feeling she'd experienced when complex military operations aligned perfectly. Tomorrow, Pine Ridge would learn what it meant to dishonor a veteran. But more importantly, David Martinez would remember what it felt like to have a family that refused to let him fight alone. Riley Thompson's memorial would indeed be about honor, just not in the way Brandon Pierce had anticipated. The morning of Riley Thompson's memorial service dawned clear and cold, with October frost painting the windows of Pine Ridge's small Methodist church. By 9 o'clock, the parking lot was filled with an unexpected mix of vehicles. Rental cars bearing out-of-state plates, pickup trucks belonging to local ranchers, and a somber black hearse that had driven up from Billings for the occasion. David Martinez stood before the mirror in Linda's guest bathroom, struggling with his dress blue uniform. His hands shook slightly as he worked the brass buttons, whether from nerves or the lingering effects of his nightmares. He couldn't say. The uniform felt foreign after months of civilian clothes, but also strangely comforting, like armor against a world that didn't quite know what to do with him. "David?" Linda's voice came through the door, gentle but concerned. "The others are here." Through the window, David could see Elena, Tank, and Amy standing beside their rental SUV, their dress blues immaculate despite the early hour. They looked like what they were, professional warriors paying respects to a fallen comrade. Elena caught sight of him in the window and offered a slight nod, not quite a salute, but carrying the same weight of acknowledgement. The Methodist Church was packed beyond capacity, with folding chairs set up in the aisles and people standing along the walls. Pastor James Mitchell, distinguished in his civilian suit but carrying himself with unmistakable military bearing, had worked with Margaret Thompson to create a service that honored both Riley's military service and his essential humanity. David entered through the side door, avoiding the main congregation, and was immediately enveloped by his squadron's protective presence. Tank's massive hand settled on his shoulder with gentle pressure, while Amy positioned herself where she could monitor his stress levels without being obvious about it. Elena stood to his left, her bearing radiating the quiet authority that had kept them all alive through 3 deployments. "He would have hated this," David whispered, looking at the packed church. "He would have loved it," Elena corrected quietly. Riley always said he wanted to matter to people beyond just his squadron. Margaret Thompson rose to deliver the first eulogy, her black dress elegant in its simplicity, her silver hair pulled back to reveal a face that had learned to carry grief with dignity. She approached the podium with measured steps, her hands steady despite the magnitude of her loss. "My son Riley was many things," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed sanctuary. "He was a pilot, a leader, a friend, but most of all, he was someone who understood that service extends beyond the battlefield." David felt his throat tighten as Margaret's words washed over him. She spoke of Riley's letters home, filled with stories about his squadron, his pride in the men and women he served with, his determination to bring everyone home safely. Riley believed that we honor the fallen not just by remembering them, but by living up to the values they died defending, Margaret continued, her gaze moving meaningfully across the congregation. Values like honor, integrity, and the fundamental dignity of every person who wears the uniform. Pastor Mitchell stepped forward as Margaret concluded, his own military background evident in his bearing as he addressed the congregation. "I served as a chaplain for 23 years, he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd counseled soldiers through their darkest moments. "I've seen heroes in every rank, from every background. But I've also seen how easily our society forgets that the person standing in line at the grocery store, the one sitting alone at the diner, might be someone who's given everything for this country." David realized that Margaret and the pastor were laying groundwork, preparing the congregation for what was to come. Elena had briefed them both, ensuring that Riley's memorial would serve a larger purpose. Elena rose to speak next, her presence commanding immediate attention from everyone in the church. She approached the podium with the confidence of someone accustomed to addressing troops before dangerous missions. Captain Thompson was the kind of pilot who made everyone around him better, Elena began. He had a gift for seeing potential in people, for believing in them even when they couldn't believe in themselves. She paused, letting her gaze move across the congregation before settling on a section where several hotel staff members sat, including Brandon Pierce, who looked increasingly uncomfortable. Riley understood that respect isn't something you earn once and keep forever. It's something you give freely to those who've demonstrated their willingness to sacrifice for others. He would have been deeply troubled to learn that any veteran in his hometown was treated as anything less than an honored member of this community. Tank stood next, his imposing frame making the pulpit seem small as he shared memories of Riley's leadership in combat. He spoke of missions where Riley's quick thinking had saved lives, of long nights in hostile territory where the captain's calm presence had held the unit together. "Captain Thompson taught us that we fight as a family," Tank said, his voice carrying across the silent sanctuary, "that when one of us is threatened or dismissed or forgotten, all of us are diminished." Amy's turn came last among the squadron members, and she approached the microphone with the clinical precision that made her such an effective medic. "As a combat medic, I've seen what happens when good people carry burdens alone," she said. "Riley Thompson never let anyone in our unit suffer in isolation. He understood that healing requires community, that respect and dignity aren't luxuries, they're necessities for the human spirit." Throughout the service, David felt something shifting inside him. The familiar weight of isolation was giving way to something else, not quite hope, but a recognition that he wasn't as alone as he'd believed. Margaret Thompson had orchestrated more than a memorial. She'd created a moment of reckoning for an entire community. As the service concluded, with a military honor guard presenting the flag to Margaret, David realized that the real ceremony was just beginning. The reception at the Grand Pine Hotel would be where words became actions, where the squadron's carefully planned response to his mistreatment would unfold. Eleanor placed a hand on his arm as they prepared to leave the church. "Ready for this?" David straightened his shoulders, feeling the weight of his uniform, the presence of his squadron, the memory of Riley's unwavering belief in doing what was right. "Riley always said we finish what we start," David replied, his voice carrying more strength than he'd felt in months. The congregation filed out into the crisp October morning, many heading toward the Grand Pine Hotel for the reception. Brandon Pierce walked among them, still unaware that the real memorial service was about to begin, one that would honor the living as much as the dead. The Grand Pine Hotel's main ballroom had been transformed for the memorial reception, with crisp white tablecloths, floral arrangements, and a display table featuring Riley Thompson's photographs, from his academy graduation to candid shots. With his squadron in Afghanistan, Margaret Thompson had spared no expense in creating a space worthy of her son's memory, and the hotel staff had responded with their finest service. Brandon Pierce moved nervously through the reception area, adjusting already perfect place settings and straightening chairs that didn't need straightening. The morning's memorial service had left him deeply unsettled, particularly the pointed comments about respecting veterans. He kept glancing toward the entrance, dreading what he somehow knew was coming. Elena Rodriguez entered the ballroom first, her dress blue uniform drawing immediate attention from the gathered crowd. Behind her came Tank Williams, his massive frame commanding respect, even in civilian company, followed by Amy Chen, whose medical ribbons and combat decorations spoke of service under fire. David Martinez brought up the rear, his own uniform displaying the Purple Heart and Bronze Star that most of Pine Ridge had never known he possessed. The transformation in the room's atmosphere was immediate and profound. Conversations quieted. As people turned to observe the squadron's entrance, their civilian clothes suddenly seeming inadequate in the presence of such obvious military bearing. Elena had timed their arrival perfectly, late enough to ensure maximum attendance, early enough to avoid appearing disrespectful to Riley's memory. Margaret Thompson approached them first, embracing each squadron member with genuine warmth before turning to address the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Margaret's voice carried clearly across the ballroom, "I'd like you to meet some very special people These are the men and women who served with my son, who kept him safe for 3 deployments, who brought him home when his luck finally ran out." She gestured toward David with particular emphasis. "This is Senior Airman David Martinez, Riley's closest friend and the person who held my son as he died serving our country." The room's attention focused on David with laser intensity, and Brandon Pierce felt his stomach drop toward his shoes. This was the same man he'd dismissed yesterday, the veteran he'd judged unworthy of the Grand Pines accommodations based solely on his appearance. Elena stepped forward, her bearing radiating the quiet authority that had made her legendary among Air Force enlisted personnel. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson," Elena said, her voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom. "We're honored to be here celebrating Riley's life and service, but we're also here to address something that happened in this very hotel yesterday, something that would have outraged Captain Thompson and dishonors the memory we're here to preserve." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, sensing drama, but uncertain of its nature. Hotel owner Robert Harrison emerged from the kitchen area, his expression grim as he began to understand what was unfolding. Tank moved to stand beside Elena, his presence adding weight to her words. "Yesterday afternoon, Senior Airman Martinez came to this hotel seeking accommodations. He was turned away by your front desk staff, despite available rooms, despite having a valid credit and identification, despite being a decorated combat veteran with 3 tours in Afghanistan." Amy stepped forward, her medical training evident in her calm, analytical delivery. "As a combat medic, I've treated hundreds of wounded warriors. I've seen what happens when society fails to recognize the humanity and dignity of those who've sacrificed for our freedom. What happened to Airman Martinez yesterday was more than just poor customer service. It was discrimination that strikes at the heart of what Captain Thompson died defending." Brandon Pierce stood frozen behind the reception desk, visible through the ballroom's open doors, his face pale as the reality of his situation became clear. He'd insulted a war hero in front of a room full of people who now understood exactly what that meant. Margaret Thompson's voice cut through the tension with maternal authority. "I chose this hotel specifically because of its reputation for hospitality and respect. When I learned that one of Riley's squadron members, a man who earned the purple, heart-saving lives in combat, was treated as unworthy of basic courtesy, I was appalled." Eleanor's gaze moved deliberately across the crowd, making eye contact with community leaders, business owners, and ordinary citizens who comprised Pine Ridge's social fabric. "We're not here to shame anyone," Elena said, her tone firm but measured. "We're here to educate, to help this community understand that the young man who might look tired or rough around the edges could be someone who's given everything for this country." David stepped forward reluctantly, his discomfort obvious, but his military bearing intact. When he spoke, his voice carried across the silent ballroom with quiet dignity. "I didn't come back from Afghanistan looking for special treatment," David said. "I just wanted to be treated like any other American citizen, like someone who belonged in the country I fought to defend." Tank's deep voice added weight to David's words. "Martinez pulled 3 airmen from a burning vehicle after an IED attack. He worked 18-hour shifts, keeping our aircraft operational so we could complete missions that saved civilian lives. He held Captain Thompson as he died, whispering promises that he'd take care of the captain's family." Amy nodded toward David with professional respect. "He's been struggling with PTSD and survivor's guilt since returning home. Yesterday's rejection at this hotel confirmed his worst fears, that he doesn't belong anywhere, that his service doesn't matter, that he's somehow less worthy of respect than people who've never put their lives on the line for others." The ballroom had gone completely silent, except for Margaret Thompson's quiet voice. "My son died believing he was protecting a country that valued honor and dignity. If we allow his friends to be treated as second-class citizens, what did he die for? Robert Harrison finally stepped forward from the kitchen area, his own military bearing becoming apparent as he approached the group. His silver hair and weathered face spoke of someone who'd seen combat himself, though few in Pine Ridge knew of his Vietnam service. "Mrs. Thompson, members of Captain Thompson's squadron." Robert's voice carried the authority of command as he addressed the room. "On behalf of the Grand Pine Hotel, I want to formally apologize for yesterday's incident. What happened to Senior Airman Martinez was inexcusable and does not represent the values this establishment should embody." He turned toward Brandon Pierce, who had emerged from behind the front desk with obvious reluctance. "Mr. Pierce, please join us." Brandon approached the group with the demeanor of a man walking toward his own execution. His earlier confidence completely evaporated in the face of the squadron's collective presence. Elena's gaze fixed on Brandon with the intensity she'd once reserved for enemy combatants. "Mr. Pierce, I believe you and Airman Martinez have met." The confrontation that followed would become the talk of Pine Ridge for months to come, but it would also mark the beginning of something larger, a community's reckoning with how it treated its veterans and a hotel clerk's journey toward understanding the true meaning of service. Brandon Pierce stood before the assembled crowd like a defendant awaiting sentencing, his face flushed with shame and growing comprehension of his mistake. The confident hotel manager who had dismissed David Martinez yesterday was nowhere to be found, replaced by a young man confronting the reality of his own prejudice for the first time. "Mr. Pierce," Elena said, her voice carrying the measured authority of someone accustomed to correcting serious errors in judgment, "would you like to explain to Senior Airman Martinez and this community why you felt he was unworthy of accommodation at your establishment?" Brandon's mouth opened and closed, soundlessly, his prepared excuses crumbling under the weight of truth. The system errors and full bookings that had seemed so clever yesterday now appeared as transparent lies in the face of David's obvious military bearing and decorations. I made a mistake," Brandon stammered, his voice barely audible, across the silent ballroom. "I judged based on appearance, and I was wrong." "You were more than wrong," Margaret Thompson said, her grief transforming into righteous anger. "You insulted every military family, every Gold Star mother, every person who's ever worn the uniform in service to this country." Robert Harrison stepped forward, his own military background evident in his bearing as he addressed his employee. "Brandon, in 30 years of running this hotel, I've never been more ashamed of our service standards. You turned away a war hero based on your own ignorance and prejudice." The crowd began murmuring among themselves, processing the full implications of what they were witnessing. Many recognized David now, Linda Martinez's older brother, the quiet kid who'd grown up on Elm Street before disappearing into military service. They were seeing him clearly for the first time, understanding that the tired-looking veteran was someone who'd sacrificed everything for their freedom. A new voice cut through the tension from the ballroom's entrance. "Excuse me, I'm Sarah Winters from the Pine Ridge Gazette." A young woman with a notepad and digital recorder moved through the crowd, her journalistic instincts drawn to the unfolding drama. "Could someone explain what's happening here?" Elena turned to face the reporter, recognizing an opportunity to amplify their message beyond the confines of the hotel ballroom. "Ms. Winters, yesterday your town's premier hotel refused service to a decorated combat veteran based solely on his appearance. Today, we're here to ensure it never happens again." Sarah's pen moved rapidly across her notepad as she absorbed the story. "And you are?" "Master Sergeant Elena Rodriguez, United States Air Force. These are Staff Sergeant Chen and Technical Sergeant Williams, along with Senior Airman Martinez, the veteran who was discriminated against." Sarah's gaze moved to David, taking in his dress blue uniform, the ribbons and decorations that spoke of service and sacrifice. Mr. Martinez, how did this incident affect you? David hesitated, his discomfort with attention evident. But Amy Chen stepped closer, providing silent support. It confirmed what I already suspected, David said quietly, that I don't really belong anywhere anymore. Amy's medic training kicked in as she addressed both the reporter and the crowd. What people don't understand is that discrimination against veterans isn't just about hurt feelings. For someone dealing with PTSD and reintegration issues, rejection like this can be psychologically devastating. It reinforces the isolation that drives too many veterans to suicide. A murmur ran through the crowd as the broader implications became clear. This wasn't just about one hotel clerk's bad judgment, it was about how the community treated all its returning veterans. From the back of the room, a gruff voice called out, "Been saying this for years." Jimmy Doc Peterson pushed through. The crowd, his VFW cap and Vietnam-era ribbons, identifying him as another veteran. Town treats its heroes like dirt until they're dead, then suddenly everyone wants to honor their sacrifice. Doc's weathered face showed the accumulated frustration of decades spent advocating for veteran rights. He approached David with the slow gait of an older soldier, recognizing a younger one carrying similar burdens. "Son," Doc said, extending his hand to David, "I'm sorry this happened to you. Should have done better by our returning warriors." Elena seized the moment to broaden the conversation. "Mr. Peterson raises an important point. This isn't just about one incident at one hotel. It's about a pattern of how veterans are perceived and treated in civilian society." Tank nodded grimly. "We've all experienced it. The assumptions, the judgments, the way people look at you when they find out you've been in combat, like you're damaged goods or a potential threat." Margaret Thompson stepped forward, her maternal authority commanding attention. "My son wrote to me about this, about how difficult it was for his squadron members to feel accepted when they came home on leave, about how society seemed more comfortable honoring dead heroes than supporting living veterans." Sarah Winters continued taking notes, recognizing that her simple story about a hotel incident was evolving into something much larger. "What would you like to see change?" Eleanor exchanged glances with her squadron members before responding. "Education first and foremost. People need to understand that veterans come in all shapes and sizes, all backgrounds, all economic levels. The person you dismiss as undesirable might be someone who's risked everything for your freedom." Robert. Harrison had been listening intently to the conversation, his own Vietnam experience informing his understanding of the issues at play. What can businesses do differently? Amy stepped forward, her analytical mind providing practical solutions. Train your staff to recognize unconscious bias. Create policies that prevent discrimination based on appearance. Consider hiring preferences for veterans who understand the challenges of reintegration. Brandon Pierce, who had been standing in mortified silence, finally found his voice. "I want to make this right," he said, his words directed primarily toward David. "I want to learn how to do better." Elena studied the young man's face, seeing genuine remorse rather than mere embarrassment at being caught. "Education is a start, Mr. Pierce, but it has to be genuine, not just damage control." Doc Peterson stepped forward again, his gruff exterior hiding a heart that had spent decades trying to heal the wounds of war. "We run support groups at the VFW, sensitivity training for businesses. You want to learn, we'll teach you." Margaret Thompson nodded approvingly. Riley always believed in second chances for people willing to earn them. Sarah Winters looked up from her notepad, recognizing the story's potential impact. "Would you be willing to continue this conversation on the record? I think the broader community needs to hear this. Elena smiled for the first time since the confrontation began. "Miss Winters, that's exactly what we were hoping you'd say." The memorial reception had transformed into something unprecedented, a community dialogue about veteran treatment sparked by one act of discrimination but encompassing years of accumulated frustration and missed opportunities for understanding. As conversations continued throughout the ballroom, David Martinez found himself surrounded by people who were seeing him clearly for the first time. Not as a problem to be managed or a charity case to be pitied, but as a hero who deserved respect, support, and a place to call home. The healing had begun for both David and Pine Ridge itself. 3 months after the memorial reception, David Martinez sat in a circle of folding chairs in the basement of Pine Ridge Methodist Church, listening to Tom Castellanos describe his nightmares from Iraq. The weekly support group had grown from 3 members to 12, with Pastor Mitchell and Doc Peterson facilitating discussions that had become essential to the community's veteran population. "It's getting better," Tom was saying, his weathered hands steady around his coffee cup. "My wife doesn't wake up anymore when I thrash around. Doc's breathing exercises actually work." David nodded, understanding the significance of that small victory. His own nightmares had become less frequent since he'd started attending the sessions, though Riley still visited him in dreams, not as an accusation now, but as encouragement. "David, you want to share about your week?" Doc Peterson asked, gently. "I started the new job," David said, surprising himself with how natural the words felt. "Working with Pastor Mitchell on the Veteran Outreach Program. We're visiting 3 high schools next week to talk about military service and transition challenges." Amy Chen, who'd taken a temporary assignment at the nearby VA clinic, smiled approvingly from across the circle. "How does it feel to be helping other veterans?" "Like I'm finally doing something Riley would approve of," David admitted. "Instead of just surviving, I'm actually living again." The transformation hadn't been immediate or easy. David had resisted accepting help for weeks after the hotel incident, but the sustained support from his squadron, his family, and increasingly from the Pine Ridge community had gradually worn down his defenses. Brandon Pierce had been the most surprising ally in David's journey. The hotel manager had thrown himself into veteran advocacy with the zeal of someone seeking genuine redemption. He'd completed sensitivity training, organized fundraisers for the VFW, and personally ensured that the Grand Pine Hotel became a veteran-friendly establishment. "I want to apologize again," Brandon had said during his first visit to the support group, his voice shaking with emotion. "I represented everything wrong with how society treats its heroes." Robert Harrison had quietly revealed his own Vietnam service during that same meeting, explaining how he'd hidden his military background for decades due to the hostile reception veterans had received in the 1970s. Under his leadership, the hotel had implemented comprehensive veteran support policies, including job placement assistance and temporary housing for homeless veterans. Linda had become an advocate in her own right, using her position as a teacher to incorporate veteran history into her curriculum. Her children now spoke proudly of their uncle's service, understanding for the first time what his medals actually meant. Even Margaret Thompson had found purpose in her grief, establishing the Riley Thompson Foundation to provide mental health support for returning veterans. Her first grant had funded the expansion of Doc Peterson support groups to 3 neighboring counties. Sarah Winters had continued covering veteran issues, her articles bringing statewide attention to Pine Ridge's transformation from a community that ignored its veterans to one that actively supported them. "Next week, we're expanding to 2 weekly meetings," Doc announced as the session concluded, "and we're starting family sessions so loved ones can understand what we're dealing with." As David walked home through downtown Pine Ridge, he noticed things that would have been invisible 6 months ago. Veterans he now recognized as fellow travelers, businesses displaying veteran-friendly signs, a community that had learned to see its heroes clearly. The healing wasn't complete, but it was real. And for the first time since Riley's death, David Martinez felt like he belonged somewhere again. 6 months after the memorial service that changed everything, David Martinez stood before a packed auditorium at Pine Ridge High School, his dress blue uniform replaced by civilian clothes that no longer felt like a costume. The transformation wasn't just in his appearance, it was in his posture, his voice, his entire presence. Where once stood a broken veteran struggling with invisible wounds, now stood a man who had found his purpose in helping others navigate the same treacherous waters he'd somehow managed to cross. Beside him, Tank Williams adjusted the microphone with the same careful precision he'd once used on aircraft components in Afghanistan. His massive frame filled out a crisp button-down shirt and khakis, the civilian clothes doing nothing to diminish. His commanding presence, Amy Chen organized presentation materials with the methodical efficiency that had made her legendary as a combat medic. Her transition to civilian healthcare, allowing her to bridge military and medical perspectives in ways that resonated with audiences. When I graduated from this school 12 years ago, David began, his voice carrying clearly to the back rows where seniors sat with the slightly skeptical attention of teenagers trying to decide whether this presentation would be worth their time. I thought I knew what heroism looked like. I thought it was all about dramatic moments, split-second decisions under fire, medals and ceremonies. In the front row, his nephew Tommy and niece Maria listened with rapt attention. They'd become his biggest supporters, proudly telling classmates about their uncle's real job, not just the aircraft maintenance he'd done in Afghanistan, but the lives he'd saved, the courage he'd shown, the sacrifice he'd made. The children who had once been afraid of the distant, damaged man who'd returned from war now understood that their uncle was someone special, someone who'd fought monsters so they could sleep safely. But I learned something important over the past 6 months, David continued, his gaze moving across the sea of young faces. Real heroism isn't just about what you do in combat. It's about what you do when you come home. It's about having the courage to ask for help when you need it, to accept support from your community, to keep fighting even when the enemy is inside your own head. Principal Waters, who'd initially been skeptical about the veteran outreach program, now watched from the side of the auditorium with obvious pride. The program had become one of the school's most requested presentations, with students asking thoughtful questions about service, sacrifice, and the real costs of defending freedom. More importantly, it had changed how the students viewed veterans in their own community, not as broken figures to be pitied, but as resources to be respected and supported. Amy stepped forward to address the psychological aspects of military service, her medical expertise lending credibility to discussions about PTSD, survivor's guilt, and the challenges of reintegration. She'd taken a temporary assignment at the nearby VA clinic, using her combat experience to help other veterans navigate the complex healthcare system. The strongest warriors aren't the ones who never fall down, Amy explained, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd patched up wounded soldiers under enemy fire. They're the ones who get back up, who keep fighting, who refuse to let their wounds define them. David here fell down harder than most people can imagine. He lost his best friend, his sense of purpose, his belief that he belonged anywhere. But he got back up. Indeed, Tank's portion focused on the bonds forged in combat, the brotherhood and sisterhood that sustained service members through the darkest moments. His deep voice carried across the silent auditorium as he shared stories that made military service real and human, rather than abstract and heroic. "Your neighbor David here," Tank said, gesturing toward his friend with obvious pride, "pulled 3 airmen from a burning vehicle after an IED attack. worked through shrapnel wounds and a concussion to drag unconscious men to safety. But what made him a hero wasn't the rescue. It was refusing to let his friends die alone, and later refusing to let his grief destroy him. The students leaned forward, genuinely engaged now. These weren't the sanitized war stories they'd seen in movies, but real accounts from people who'd lived through experiences beyond their imagination and somehow found ways to heal and contribute. After the presentation, students surrounded them with questions that revealed a depth of understanding that would have been impossible before the hotel incident. These teenagers had witnessed their community's transformation, had seen how prejudice could be replaced with respect, how ignorance could give way to education. They wanted to know about military opportunities, about how to support veteran family members, about what they could do as civilians to help returning warriors. "My dad was in Desert Storm," one student said to David. "He never talks about it, but sometimes I hear him having nightmares. How can I help him?" David's response came from hard-won experience. "Tell him about our support group. Tell him he's not alone. Sometimes the hardest thing for a veteran is admitting they need help, but knowing that help is available can make all the difference." Margaret Thompson approached from the back of the auditorium, her presence still commanding attention, despite the months that had passed since Riley's memorial. She'd become a fixture at these presentations, adding a mother's perspective to discussions about sacrifice and service. The Riley Thompson Foundation had grown beyond her initial vision, now funding mental health programs in 3 states and serving as a model for veteran family support. "Mrs. Thompson," a student called out, "what would your son think about all this?" Margaret's smile carried both sadness and pride, the complex expression of someone who'd learned to find meaning in loss. Riley would be amazed by what this community has accomplished. He always believed that real change happened one person at a time, one conversation at a time. He'd be proud of David for finding his voice, proud of this town for opening its heart, and proud that his death led to something constructive rather than just more grief. And so as the students filed out, chattering excitedly about military opportunities and veteran issues, David felt the familiar warmth of purpose that had replaced his earlier sense of displacement. The broken veteran who'd sought anonymity at the Grand Pine Hotel 6 months ago had been transformed into an advocate, educator, and living example of resilience. Elena Rodriguez appeared in the auditorium doorway, her visit timed to coincide with the school presentation. She'd been promoted to Senior Master Sergeant and was now implementing veteran support programs across multiple Air Force bases, using Pine Ridge as a model for community engagement. Her dress blues displayed new ribbons recognizing her innovative approaches to veteran transition assistance. "How'd it go?" Eleanor asked, embracing David with the warmth of someone who'd watched him transform from a broken warrior into a healed leader. "Better than I expected," David replied. "These kids get it in ways their parents sometimes don't. They understand that strength isn't about never showing weakness, it's about overcoming it." They walked together toward the Grand Pine Hotel, where the monthly veteran community meeting was scheduled to take place. Robert Harrison had transformed the hotel's conference room into a permanent gathering space for veteran activities, complete with resource materials, job placement assistance, and a wall of honor featuring local service members. The same hotel that had once rejected David now served as the headquarters for regional veteran support initiatives. Brandon Pierce greeted them at the hotel entrance, his transformation as dramatic as David's in its own way. The arrogant desk clerk had become a passionate advocate for veteran rights, completing his college degree in social work and dedicating himself to helping other businesses implement veteran-friendly policies. His journey from ignorance to understanding had become a powerful example of how education could overcome prejudice. "David, good to see you," Brandon said, his greeting carrying genuine warmth. The relationship between them had evolved from confrontation to mutual respect, with Brandon viewing David as both mentor and friend. The new housing program is ready to launch. We've got 3 businesses committed to hiring preferences and 5 families willing to provide temporary housing for homeless veterans. The transformation in Brandon's life had been remarkable to witness. He'd thrown himself into veteran advocacy with the zeal of someone seeking not just redemption, but genuine understanding. He'd spent weekends at the VA hospital, attended every support group meeting, and used his business connections to expand opportunities for veterans throughout the region. The conference room was packed with familiar faces, Doc Peterson coordinating with Pastor Mitchell on expanded support services, Sarah Winters documenting the community's ongoing transformation for a book she was writing about veteran reintegration, Linda and Tom representing the civilian perspective on veteran family support. The room buzzed with the energy of people engaged in meaningful work. Amy had prepared a presentation on the psychological benefits of community integration, showing statistical improvements in veteran mental health outcomes since the support programs began. The data was impressive. Suicide rates down, employment up, family stability improved. But the real stories were in the faces around the room. We've documented a 40% reduction in veteran mental health crises since implementing the comprehensive support model, Amy reported, her medical training evident in her precise delivery. But more importantly, we've seen veterans transition from isolation to engagement, from despair to purpose. Tank shared success stories from other communities that had implemented similar initiatives after learning about Pine Ridge's model. Phone calls came weekly from mayors, veterans organizations, and military transition specialists wanting to understand how a small Montana town had achieved such remarkable results. We've had inquiries from 17 towns across 3 states. Elena announced to the group, Pine Ridge has become a template for how communities can support their veterans effectively. The Pentagon is studying our model for potential nationwide implementation. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Pine Ridge, a town that had unknowingly rejected a war hero 6 months earlier, was now teaching the nation how to properly honor and support its veterans. Doc Peterson stood to address the group, his gruff exterior softened by the satisfaction of seeing his decades of advocacy finally bearing fruit. "Been fighting for veteran recognition for 40 years, he said, his voice carrying the weight of those battles. Never thought I'd see the day when civilians actually understood what we've been trying to tell them." Pastor Mitchell nodded in agreement. The community has learned that supporting veterans isn't just about parades and flag waving. It's about providing practical assistance, understanding trauma, and creating spaces where healing can happen. Sarah Winters had documented the entire transformation for her newspaper and was now working on a book about veteran reintegration. "What makes Pine Ridge's model unique," she said, "is that it addresses both individual and community healing. The town didn't just help David, it helped itself understand what it means to truly honor service." David looked around the room. The same hotel where he'd been rejected and humiliated, now transformed into a center for healing and support. Margaret Thompson sat beside Doc Peterson, planning the expansion of the Riley Thompson Foundation. Brandon Pierce took notes on new initiatives with the dedication of someone who'd found his calling in service to others. Linda caught David's eye from across the room, her smile reflecting the relief of a sister who'd watched her brother find his way back from the brink. Her children's school projects now featured their uncle's military service, and she'd become an advocate for veteran families throughout the school district. Riley always said that the best missions were the ones where everybody comes home, David said, addressing the gathering. His voice carried the authority of experience earned through struggle and growth. 6 months ago, I didn't think I'd ever really come home from Afghanistan. But this community, this family, brought me back. Eleanor nodded approvingly. And now, you're helping bring others home too. The meeting continued with reports on new initiatives, a job training program for transitioning veterans, partnerships with local businesses for hiring preferences, expansion of mental health services, and plans for a regional conference on veteran support. What had begun as a response to one act of discrimination had evolved into a comprehensive model for community-based veteran assistance. As the meeting concluded and people began to file out into the Montana evening, David remained behind, studying the wall of honor that featured Riley's photograph alongside dozens of other local veterans. The display had grown from Margaret's initial memorial to include service members from multiple generations, creating a visual reminder of the community's military heritage. Margaret Thompson joined him, her hand settling gently on his shoulder, with the gentle pressure of someone who'd learned to find comfort in shared memory rather than isolation in grief. "He's proud of you," she said softly, her gaze fixed on Riley's photograph. "All of them are." David Martinez, veteran of 3 tours in Afghanistan, survivor of discrimination and PTSD, now community leader and advocate, finally understood what coming home really meant. It wasn't about returning to the place you'd left. It was about finding the place where you belonged, where your service mattered, where your struggles made you stronger rather than weaker. Pine Ridge had become that place, not just for David, but for every veteran who needed to remember that they were valued, respected, and never truly alone. The small Montana town had learned that honoring veterans meant more than flag displays and holiday parades. It meant creating communities where warriors could heal, contribute, and find purpose beyond the battlefield. The mission was complete. Everyone had come home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.